Today we'll continue our series on doctrinal extremes. We'll look at part two, hollow log doctrine. Hollow log doctrine states that the Spirit of God can enter a sinner and have no effect on him in similar fashion to how a rabbit running through a hollow log has little to no impact on the log. Simply stated, the idea exists that the Spirit of God entering into a person, causing regeneration, the person is born again, but they have no external or literally no change happens to that individual. The change is produced by exposure to the gospel. Otherwise, there's no evidence that the Spirit of God has had any impact on that person. Hence the name hollow log doctrine. The Spirit comes into a person, indwells that person, and there is no change to that person at all. The first challenging text we'll look at is 2 Corinthians 5:17. It implies to us, it absolutely states and declares outright the fact that regeneration is transformative. Therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. That sounds very transformative to me. It undoubtedly is transformative. We're going from a state of old things, from being old to new, a new creature. That's a new creation. Looking at some passages from the Old Testament, let's look at Jeremiah 31 and 33 on the screen here. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord. But they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, saith the Lord, for I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. Ezekiel 11:19, something very similar. He says, I will put a new spirit within you, and I will take the stony heart out of their flesh, and will give them an heart of flesh. In 36:26, I know I didn't read the whole thing, but it's there on the screen to read. It says, A new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you, and I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh, and I will give you an heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you, and cause you to walk in my statutes, and ye shall keep my judgments and do them. Does it sound very much like that the change he's speaking of has no effect? Does it sound very much like what God is doing in their heart is having no impact on their person? It absolutely sounds like it's having an impact. It sounds like to me that it's actually affecting the way that they live their life. In 27, what we just read there, it says, And cause you to walk in my statutes, and ye shall keep my judgments and do them. This change that he's talking about is one that drives them or draws them, however you want to look at this thing. In one way or another, it gives them the motivation to serve the Lord. Now, looking in the New Testament, starting Hebrews 8 and verse 10, it says, For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind, and write them in their hearts, and I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me people. And they shall not teach every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least to the greatest. And we just read something very similar to that, didn't we? We read that in the Old Testament out of Jeremiah. But here we have it in the New Testament, and that's being repeated as a reflection of the work of the Spirit on an individual at the point of regeneration. Hebrews chapter 10, now in verse 16, it says, This is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their hearts and in their minds, and in their minds will I write them, and their sins and iniquities will I remember no more. And if you remember, these texts in the Old Testament we just read sounded very much like the effect would be an actual change. Not like a rabbit running through a log has no impact on the log. This is something that's having a great impact on the log. If you want to compare a person to a log, this is making that log a completely new vessel. He's going from, this is a terrible analogy. I don't want to continue with the log, but you get the idea. I'm not a very big fan of comparing the child of God to a log, but if the Spirit of God moving through the log made moving through a person was like that of the rabbit running through a log, the log would experience a complete and total transformation. And that's what these texts are telling us, that there is a very real, manifested change to the child of God whenever the Spirit comes in and writes the laws within their heart and in their mind, in their inward parts. The whole nature of the heart is changed. It goes from something that's cold and hard and insensible to something that can be touched, that can be moved, that can have feeling, a heart of flesh. It literally is like this next scene here. What we're looking at is the imagery of, on one side you have death, and the other side you have life. That's literally what it is. Regeneration, or being born again, is comparable to being changed from a state of dead in trespasses and in sins, just like in Ephesians 2 there on the screen, to a state of being alive. Um, in John chapter 5 and verse 22, it says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, the hour is coming, and now is," so that you know that whenever he's saying this, the thing that he's speaking of is already occurring. And continuing, it says, "When the dead shall hear the voice of the Son of God, and they that hear shall live." Now, in the same context, if you want to open up your Bibles and go to John chapter 5, continue on reading, he's going to say later on, only maybe two or three, probably three or four, somewhere that I don't have it available to me to look right at it. But he says, "Marvel not at this, for the hour is coming in the which they that are in the graves shall hear his voice and shall come forth." Of course, I didn't do an exact quote, so when you read it, keep that in mind, that it's not going to read exactly the way that I just said it. But the point is, marvel not at this is definitely in that text. The people that are in the graves indicates that in this verse is a death that is not the same as one being dead in the graves. This is someone that's dead in the sense of Ephesians 2 and 1, which is why that's provided on the page here. "And you hath he quickened who were dead." How? "In trespasses and in sins." This is a state in which an individual has no interest, desire, or affection towards, no no part of them has any willingness towards God or goodness. In fact, contrary to that, they have opposition towards it. They are in enmity against it. We find that in Romans chapter 8. In the very beginning part of the chapter, it tells us how that enmity, that to be carnally minded, is enmity with God. That means that we were enemies with him. No, he took us from a state of being dead. Now, in this verse, Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 1, that word quicken is provided, and it's supposed to be there. I've heard folks say that that word quickened is used in the Old Testament as just to mean revived. And so in the New Testament, whenever we read this and it says, "And you hath he quickened," folks have wanted to say it doesn't just mean made alive, it means revived. And revived can be, a- you can be revived from a state of being weak and frail and on the verge of calamity, on the verge of death, but not all the way there. However, in this context, that word quickened, we'll just pretend for a minute there that it's revived, and it still carries with it the same idea. But when you look at what they're revived from, and I contend that the word should have been quickened, it is quickened, it should be quickened, but we'll just play the game for a minute. Let's say that it was revived, who were dead. That word dead comes from the word nekros in Greek, and it may be pronounced a little different. I'm not a Greek scholar enough to know that the word necros is pronounced one way or another, but that word necros is where we get the word necrotic. And necrotic is death at the tissue level, where there is deterioration of the cell components that make up the tissue, the rancid type of death. It says, and you hath he quickened or revived, if you will, who were dead, rancid in trespasses and sins. There's only one way to revive something that's dead and rancid and rotted. That is to make it alive. So, anyway, this text teaches us that we were dead and made alive. You can't get much more transformative than that, to go from a state where you're a rotten corpse to a state where you're living and breathing, vibrant uh, individual. And how can it not be transformative? It's God within us. It's God within the person. In Colossians 1:27 it says, to whom God would make known what is the riches of the glory of this mystery among the Gentiles, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. He's literally taking up residence within you. In 1 Corinthians 3:16, know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? Remember, the temple in the Old Testament was where God Himself was dwelling, particularly the tabernacle, but the temple, that's the place where the presence of God is. The priest would go in and make sacrifice in the temple because that's the place where God would meet them there. He is indwelling His people. When a person is born again, when they're regenerated, when they are made alive, they are indwelt by the Spirit of God. You, as a child of God, are indwelt with His Spirit. You as a person are the temple of God. He's dwelling within you. Second Corinthians 6:16. And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God. I love to think of that he says of the living God, as opposed to all these idols out there, all the false gods and the false doctrines, the false religions. We're talking about the real deal here, the real living and true God. God hath said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And I love this text in 2 Corinthians 4 and 6, when we're talking about the transformative nature of God dwelling within His people, the transformative nature of the work of regeneration. Listen to this. For God, who commanded the light to shine out of darkness, hath shined in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. There's another text, and I didn't include it into this video, that tells us that we were once darkness. It calls us the darkness. And when you consider that, and then in light of this verse, for God who commanded the light to shine out of darkness hath shined in our hearts a place where there was utter darkness, to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. This is to take a place where there was nothing but dark and wickedness, we would add, and correctly, because our heart is desperately wicked. And in the Old Testament, it's said this way, and who could know it? That's us. And God has transformed our heart from that of being like a stone to a place that's like flesh. It's a place of feeling. It's a place where He resides, a place where He's illuminated with His glorious light. And notice in this text, it says, glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ, which tells us this knowledge that He's giving, this law that He's putting within the heart, this information that goes there is one of an experience. It's a knowledge based upon an experience with God. Because when you have an experience with God, that changes everything. It says, one more time with this, to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God, not in the name of Jesus Christ, which is important, but in this case, it's in the face of Jesus Christ, which gives you the idea or projects the thought of an experience over that of a rational understanding. It's the type of knowledge that one would have of, say, if you put your finger on in a fire and you were trying to explain to someone how it felt, and that person had never felt heat before. How would you explain it? If the person had no way to understand what heat was, you would have a great deal of difficulty explaining to them exactly what being burnt was like. This is a knowledge that He gives by experience. In the same token, if you're talking to someone who has never been able to see, and then you're trying to explain to them the color red, but the person has never seen before, when they see for the first time and they behold the color red, they're able to understand with a knowledge based upon experience more than anything that they could have had by rationalization. And I know that I've spent a lot of time on this, but it's so profound to me, the fact that the knowledge that He's given to His people in their hearts, whenever He shines His light in their hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ, it is a knowledge of experience. It's something that goes beyond logic. It's something that they know because of what they have felt, what they have seen, what has been done within them. It could not be told to them by someone trying to explain it. And when we try to relate to the person that subscribes to the hololog doctrine, I sometimes wonder if perhaps the confusion comes from not really knowing what to look for. So I'd like to take a moment and consider, what are the evidences that God has done a work in the heart of a person. Now, regeneration, when it happens, I just explained how that God makes himself known by experience to a person, not by logic and rationalization and deductions of the mind. This is something that he does in the heart by an experience of grace. And this produces change, not necessarily knowledge of the gospel, because the gospel is something that we share one with another, that he's given us the Bible to study and to learn about. We go to church and we share the good news one with another, and we rejoice and we study God's word, and we learn and grow in more and more day by day. But what is the change that happens? And I'm going to give a little pre prelude into another video that I would like to make on the topic of what it is that God teaches that no man can teach. So you'll get just a little glimpse of that in my answer here. What are the evidences that God has done the work in the heart of a person? The first one we'll look at is the person knows love. In 1 John 4 and 7 it says, Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone that loveth is born of God, and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. In the First Thessalonians 4 and verse 9 it says, But as touching brotherly love, ye need not that I write unto you, for ye yourselves are taught of God to love one another. This tells us that if someone is born of God, that they have love. Now, this is not just simply a love of familiarity or a love of interest. This is a love that is self-sacrificial, a love that is in action, a love that gives of self for the betterment of somebody else. The word used here is the word agapeo, and you may not have that pronounced exactly correct, but agapeo, it's on the screen here. It's G25 in the Strong's numbers. Also on the screen is G26. These two words refer to the same thing in that the agape love is the noun form and the verb form is agapeo. So this is like the difference of saying an individual loves such and such versus it is love that they have. So again, beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and every man that loveth is born of God. So if you find a person that has genuine love, and let me qualify this a little bit further, it's the same word as used in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 when it's translated charity. This kind of love is one that's willing to sacrifice personal desires and interests for someone else's betterment. The old adage, so and so would give you the shirt off their back. And of course, that statement embodies the idea that the person in question would give something that they need themselves in order to help somebody else. That's not something that is natural to this world. It's not something that people get from their carnal nature. This is something that they get from God. And if indeed it is so that a person has a charitable heart, that they know that agape love, that they really are willing to give you the shirt off their back, that's something that declares God has had a work, done a work in their heart. That's genuine love. If there is an internal warfare, that is an evidence that God has done a work in the heart of that individual. And we read in Romans chapter 7, verses 14 through 23, the warfare that the Apostle Paul describes, and I would read through it. And it's a little bit difficult to read because he goes back and forth. He's literally saying the things that he would do, those aren't the things that he's doing. And the things that he wouldn't do, those are the things he's doing. And he goes back and forth, showing that he's all the time doing the wrong thing, like he's wanting to do this, but he's not doing that. And he's not wanting to do this other, but that's the very thing that he is doing. In verse 20 it says, "Now if I do that I would not, it is no more sin that no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. I find then a law that when I would do good, evil is present with me." People that are not born again do not have a struggle like this. I'm not saying that they don't have any trouble in this world because of sinfulness. I'm saying that the internal battle and conflict of good and evil isn't there, because the good that an individual has in their heart comes from God, and the carnal nature is always there. But when the Lord indwells a person, there is a conflict between the flesh and the spirit of a person, constantly constantly warring, trying to bring them back into subjection, to return them unto a fleshly behavior. And of course, if we follow that, we'll be like Lot was. We'll be vexed by the sinful conversation of ourselves as well as others. In Romans 8 and verse 6, it says, "For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace, because the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be." And a moment ago we referred to this text, but it didn't give you the exact place where it was, and here we are reading it. Because the carnal mind is enmity, that means it's in abject hatred of, it is an active enemy against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be. So then they that are in the flesh cannot please God, but ye are in the spirit. Excuse me, but ye are not in the flesh, but in the spirit, if so be, how, what was it qualifying here? If so be that the Spirit of God dwell in you. Now, if any man have not the Spirit of Christ, he is none of his. So he's saying that if you have the Spirit of God within you, that that you have a part of you that it's not actively in hatred with God, and in fact, contrary wise. This is the part that seeks God. This is the part that craves God, that wants to do good. The part that the Apostle Paul in Romans 7 was craving after the law of God in 7:22 down here on the bottom left. Is for I delight in the law of God after the inward man. So the conflict and war, if you find a person that is struggling against sin and they're despairing within, oh, they feel so burdened down with the weight of their conflict within. Perhaps they have been involved in sinful activities and they're just burdened down with guilt. Folks, a person that's not born of God, a person that doesn't have the Spirit of God within them, doesn't feel the guilt of what they've done. They'll feel bad if they get caught, but they don't feel like they have broken a uh, they don't feel like that they have broken a moral code, have crossed the line to break integrity. They don't feel like a dirtiness is on them whenever they're not doing the right thing. A child of God, however, is in warfare. That is another indicator that that this person is a child of God, another indicator that the person in question has had a change. And last of all, probably the most obvious, the best descriptor to me is this text in Galatians 5:22 and 23. It is the fruit that's manifested by the person indwelt by the Spirit of God. Person that has the Spirit of God within them manifest these attributes, this fruit. It says, but the fruit of the Spirit, but the fruit of the Spirit is, and the way it's worded, the fruit there is singular. Everything else that's going to follow are attributes of it, such as it's a pomegranate on the tree here. I guess it's a pomegranate. Is that a pomegranate? Oh, yeah, I think it is. You could describe the pomegranate as being red and sweet with sections within it and full of seeds. Those are characteristics of the pomegranate. This now is going to list us characteristics of the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is love, and we already mentioned love, but notice it's the first thing in the list. It may very well be that when folks see your good conversation or when they notice that you're a child of God, it may very well be the first thing they notice is that you're a loving person, particularly when someone comes to your church and they have good things to say about it. One of the first things that they might notice is that they're loving people, because those that love are demonstrating the fruit of the Spirit: joy, peace, long suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Joy. And the joy that comes from the Spirit of God is not something that's transient and happiness. It's a true joy, a joy that's found in the Lord and in His comfort, peace. And I add this statement of the comfort of God and His Spirit. There's a certain confidence and and comfort of safety to when the Lord is there. These things come out. You feel a sense of security in the Lord, and with that is peace as well as joy and long suffering. It's the people of God that are truly willing to be patient and to suffer long with somebody. Gentleness, goodness, another text to consider when we think of goodness: every good and perfect gift coming from the Lord, coming from the Father of lights. This right here, goodness. Think of how sometimes people will say so and so is a good person. Well, if he's a good person, then he must be a child of God. Now, some people are identified as good people, and we don't really know. But if it's true about that person that he's a good person, then he's a child of God. It's a change that's been made by the Spirit of God. Faith, meekness, and temperance. And of course, when we think of the change made by the Spirit of God working inside of a person's heart, one of the first things that a person might expect is that they will believe in God. And faith is one of the hallmarks of a child of God. But this right here, this faith that comes from the Spirit of God, is something that the Lord gives Himself, something that no man authors. You don't just suddenly decide to have it. It's something that's sprouted and germinated by the Spirit of God within you. And we can talk more about that, and we certainly will here in the future. Meekness and temperance here is self-control. Now, if you see someone that is called being full of the Spirit, this person is filled with the Spirit of God, the Spirit is just overflowing. If it's true, then that person should demonstrate some temperance, some love and peace and gentleness and goodness and faith. In other words, they should exhibit some self-control. And that little piece of information right there should help us weed out some of the uh, some of the ones that aren't as genuine as others. Just leave it at that. Okay, well, that's going to be it for today. Um, Next time, we'll continue with another topic concerning the extremes of doctrine or doctrinal extremes. I hope the Lord will richly bless you in your further Bible studies